hot. So I was sort of grumpy and desperately finding somewhere to buy a bottle of water, and I couldn't find anywhere. And you know how you get in those like feeling sorry for yourself kind of situations. And so there I am wandering along, and I headed into what was clearly a black part of town, both historically and currently. And as I started walking, I was looking at my little map, and I knew I was about 3 blocks from Dr. King's house, which was going to be on the left. I suddenly realized in a move that quite literally stopped me in my tracks that the state of Alabama had bought all of the land in about the 5 blocks on the other side of Dr. King's house and had built a large correctional facility, and that is where they house the headquarters for the Department of Corrections for the entire state. So literally, as I sat on the doorstep of Dr. King's parsonage, which was closed, but I sat there for half an hour waiting because I had hope that someone might come and open it up. It was a parade of mostly black men walking to and from appointments, either turning themselves in or appointments for parole. Several of them stopped and talked to me, so I had a few chats, but it was jaw-dropping. It was, I just got this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach when I looked, because you know that was not an accident that the state of Alabama built that Department of Corrections headquarters right across the street from Dr. King's house. That was intentional. And it was that juxtaposition all over the place. I think last time I talked about how Martin Luther King Boulevard was right next to Jackson, or Jefferson Davis Street. And it's just, it doesn't compute. It's really hard to compute. So from Dr. King's house and the prison, I walked to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Dr. King's church. It was closed. It would have been open, but they were filming that day. It was like a big thing in Montgomery. They were filming an episode of the Wonder Years, a new version that focuses on a black family, so they were filming it there, so I didn't get to go in. But that church is where King accepted the call while he was finishing his doctoral studies at Boston University. And apparently on the 2nd of May, 1954, King told his new congregation, quote, "I have no pretense to being a great preacher or even a profound scholar. I certainly have no pretense to infallibility. That is reserved for the height of the divine rather than the depth of the human. I come to you with only the claim of being a servant of Christ and a feeling of dependence on his grace for my leadership. I come with a feeling that I have been called to preach and to lead God's people." I think he was selling himself a little short. And after accepting the position, he proposed a list of things for the revitalization of the church. He insisted that every church member become a registered voter and a member of the NAACP. He organized a social and political action committee in the church for the purpose of keeping the congregation intelligently informed concerning the social, political, and economic situation. And it was on 2nd December 1955 in that church that King conducted a meeting in the basement and resulted in the decision to launch the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So that's where that whole situation started. And it was where the MIA, which I'm forgetting what that stands for, Montgomery, and King became its president and helped organize and direct the boycott from his office, and he served as president of that after the boycott. And he stayed at Dexter until 1959 and then joined his father as co-pastor at Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church. And that was so he could more effectively lead the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was headquartered in Atlanta. I found out in one of the museums, I can't remember which, that there was a woman named Joanne Robinson who was actually responsible for Dr. King being invited to speak at one of the bus boycott meetings. She was one of his parishioners. It was right after he got there, and the leaders were having a meeting to talk about who could organize them. And she said, well, I think he's young, he doesn't have much experience, but he's a fairly good speaker. And so that's how no one else wanted the job. So he got elected as head of this group that ended up being certainly one of the foundation stones of the civil rights action in the 50s and 60s. So from there, from the Dexter Street Baptist, I went to the Civil Rights Memorial Center. It was closed, but the memorial was open, and it was based on "Let Freedom Roll Like a Mighty River" that Dr. King used so effectively. So it was a granite wall. Again, you might want to Google this. It was a granite wall with those words on it, with water just constantly flowing over it. And then there was a large sort of circle-shaped granite monument in the center that had water that also overflowed from it and had the names of people who had been involved in the civil rights movement on it, and a timeline with important events in the civil rights movement. That was set up by the Southern Poverty Law Center, whose headquarters is right there, right across the street from it. So then I walked down to the National Peace and Justice Center because I was looking at my little map and I was trying to hit all the things. And then I realized that actually is part of the Legacy Museum where I was scheduled to go the next day. So I bagged that. And I went and sat in the center of town near the courthouse, not far from the hotel I was staying in. It was a beautiful square with a very lovely, gracious, giant fountain. There was a statue of Rosa Parks on the other side of the street because it was close to there that she refused to give up her seat on the bus. And you know how you just get a gut feeling about a place? And I'm just kind of thinking, well, this is lovely, but there's something a little off here. I ate lunch there 2 days in a row. And then I found out when I actually went to the Legacy Museum that that was the site of the largest auction block for enslaved black people in the South, and that hundreds of thousands of black Americans, this was the domestic trade, so this wasn't bringing people from Africa to the States, this was sort of the second half of the spread of slavery. They were brought from places further in the north down to the river, down the river, were taken into a giant warehouse in Montgomery, and then were walked literally right past up the street, the little street on the hotel where I was staying, to this, what's now a lovely square with a lovely fountain, no marker there, that hundreds of thousands of people were sold, were separated from their families permanently, were treated horrifically. And when I found that out, again, it's that horrifying juxtaposition of the white leadership of the city, the need to not memorialize that. I was stunned that there was absolutely nothing there that told you the history of this place. And I was struck by how much, despite that, there was something lingering in the air. You know, when I was sitting there having lunch, I was kind of like, this feels a little funny, like there's something wrong with this picture. There's a lot wrong with the picture. So anyhow, so that was, and then I went to the Freedom Rides Museum, which is in the Greyhound bus terminal where the Freedom Riders were attacked. They've left most of, so it is literally the Greyhound bus station. They've got a little museum that's sort of part of it. But when you go in, you know, they give you the, it's not a huge place, but they give you the tour, and they haven't changed the floors. So there's literally the tile where, I mean, one of the women said, well, and this is where John Lewis was hit, had been struck to the ground and was hit over the head with a Coca-Cola bottle. And you know, you're standing on sacred ground. So all of these things that, as a white person, I had been able to distance myself from and read about, but never had to sort of feel in my gut, I'm suddenly confronted with, okay, this is actually where this happened, just like my experience walking over the bridge at Selma. And funnily enough, the bathroom is exactly as it was. In the bathroom, this seems like a bizarre thing, but the bathroom is huge. This is not a big place. The bathroom is huge, and it's still, it's like the original 1950s tile, so it was this really horrific shade of sort of pink. But again, that was the actual place where Freedom Riders went to try and clean themselves up or barricade themselves while they were being attacked. Yeah. And there was in a display, and then I went to the Rosa Parks Museum as well, and that was kind of cool because you get in, when you first go there, they put you in what seems like a giant bus, and they take you through time back to before even the founding of the United States, and then sort of walks you through the civil rights, through to the civil rights era and Rosa Parks. And the other half of the museum was sort of a telling of her action, the whole bus boycott. And there was one display that referenced Dr. King after he'd gotten, so this was like a display with a life-size image of Dr. King sitting at his kitchen table with the clock, I think, showing midnight. Apparently it memorializes a night that he got a phone call, a really abusive phone call from someone threatening to kill him and his children. And they said, if you don't leave Montgomery in 3 days, you're all dead. So he was sitting alone in his kitchen after midnight, wondering if he was hearing God right, that his call was in fact the call to work for justice. And what he reported later was that he very clearly heard God's response, and that it was, in fact, for him to carry on with this work. And from then on, he felt this sense that he knew that God was actually with him, was marching with him, and it gave him sort of the centeredness and the courage to go on and do what he did. And I will say that after spending the day doing that, I was pretty beat, so I actually called it a day a little early. I got some fabulous barbecue and went back to my hotel room and just sort of tried to process what I'd seen. And then the next day I went to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and to the Legacy Museum. This is the work of Bryan Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative. So if you saw the movie or read the book Just Mercy, he's the man behind this. And so, a lot of what they work for is, Bryan Stevenson's whole mission is aside from to help people, black men in particular, black people who have been incarcerated unjustly, to help win their freedom, but he also believes that we have to tell the truth, that we have to tell the truth of our history, that most Americans don't know anywhere near the truth of the history of this country, and particularly the history of black people. And so we have to do that in order to make any move towards reconciliation, restitution, that you have to actually know the truth. And so this is why they founded this museum. It moved just a couple of years ago into a new gigantic space, which really was just around the corner from where I was staying. So he envisioned this, the museum and the memorial as a sacred space for truth-telling and reflection about racial terror in America and its legacy. And when you go into the museum, the first room, it's a video that tells you about the transatlantic slave trade, in which at least 12 million people were kidnapped, mostly from West Africa, and brought across what's called the Middle Passage in ships, many of whom, at least 2 million, did not survive the journey, dying of the terrible conditions, malnutrition, disease, being abused, beaten. And so they showed a map of the slave trade, the beginning of it, how it started, mostly going to South America and some up to the northern parts of the United States. See, we Northerners tend to think that this is a Southern problem, and it was expressed differently in the South than in the North, but this is a problem for this whole nation. And then it shows over time, over the years, so you suddenly see all of the movement changing from South America and the north of the United States coming into Maryland, Delaware, North Carolina, South Carolina, and then you see the move from the transatlantic slave trade to the domestic slave trade, which happened in, I believe, about the 1820s, 1830s. And so then the transatlantic slave trade was winding down, but then they started moving enslaved Black Americans Black Africans within the United States. So you see this film, and it's as if you're at sea. They give you the data, and then there's this, you're just seeing waves rolling over you. And you go immediately from that room into another room that actually haunts me. There's a Ghanaian sculptor that Bryan Stevenson worked with to do sculptures both in the Legacy Museum and at the Lynching Memorial. And you walk into the room and you can hear the sounds of the ocean, and there's sand all over the ground, so it's as if you're on the bottom of the ocean. It's a memorial to the people who died and whose bodies were thrown overboard. And so littering the floor of this room are life-size statues of Black Africans who died on the way over. And that's your entrance into this museum. And I can still see the faces of those statues. Again, you cannot look away when you can't distance yourself, you can't look away when you're standing looking at an ocean floor with bodies strewn all over it. It was one of the most powerful parts of that museum. And the rest of it, I mean, I spent 5 hours in this museum. It was all I could take emotionally, but I could have spent so much longer in there. So they move through sort of talking about the slave trade. You realize when you're in about the third room, when they're showing people held in warehouses before they were sold, that actually the Legacy Museum is in what was the largest warehouse for Black Africans. So they took over this giant warehouse that housed about 500,000 people on their way to be sold. And that's where this museum resides. So everything you're standing in is sacred ground. And they have some interactive, like holograms. So when you walk up to a cell, the person in there tells you their story. And then you walk through explaining sort of the Civil War, and then the brief period afterwards. And there was one whole room that was covered in newspaper ads that Black people had taken out to try and find their loved ones from whom they'd been separated. So it was these heart-wrenching things like looking for a woman by the name of Bertha. She was sold, she's my mother, she was sold to so-and-so. I'm desperately trying to find her if you have any information. And there were hundreds and hundreds of these ads, and of course they said the vast majority of them never found their spouse, their mother, their father, their child. All of these people, all of these stories of people whose lives were just destroyed. So then after the brief period in which it looked like Black people might actually be, there were Black people elected to hold to local and statewide offices, and it looked like perhaps the tide had turned, but of course it hadn't. We white people couldn't tolerate the idea of Black people actually being equal and actually having some power, and in many places they would have more power than white people because they outnumbered white people. So you end up with Jim Crow. Bryan Stevenson said slavery did not end, it just evolved. So then we begin the story of lynchings. So the museum, one of Bryan Stevenson's projects has been to put up memorials wherever a lynching occurred and to gather people, descendants of those who were lynched. Obviously there are some places where someone was lynched and you don't know who it was, but where there are records, the families, and there were several poignant films of this in the museum, with the families talking about what had happened and how generations later that lynching still reverberated through that family, how people suddenly picked up and left. They fled the South to go north because you never knew when a white mob was going to show up at your door. They would advertise it in advance. Like, you know, there would be newspaper ads that would say, come tomorrow at 3 o'clock, where we're going to lynch so-and-so. There were pictures in the museum of the bodies of some people who'd been lynched. And, you know, I mean, I'm a former medical person. I've seen a lot. I used to joke that I could eat a sandwich with one hand and deliver a baby with another. It just doesn't, you know. But to see what they did to those people, there was one, and I'm not going to apologize. Apparently, one of the things they would do, and this was news to me, is they would torture someone, a black person. They would set them on fire. They would put the fire out before they died, and then they would torture them some more, and then light them on fire again, and then put the fire out, and torture them some more. So it, you know, I guess what I thought I knew about lynching was none of it was good, but that it was fairly quick in that you'd be hanged. That is absolutely not the case. And to see what one human being did to another human being because they were black was just, I will never forget those images. But anyway, this project, so they are collecting, in the museum, they are collecting soil from every place that they know that there was a lynching. So there are all of these jars. There's one huge wall that's just row after row of jars of soil from the place that the people were lynched. And many of them have names. There are some that have unknown. But you're standing in front of this wall of thousands, and they're just starting. You know, they've got a lot more to do. You move from there into the more about the civil rights movement, and then one of the last rooms focuses on the school to prison pipeline and how mass incarceration is part of the latest iteration of enslavement, of slavery, and again, there are holographic images. So the whole room is set up as if you're visiting someone in prison. I don't know, I mean, has anyone ever visited someone in prison? Yeah. So you know, you sort of go in and they take everything away from you, and then you're ushered into a little room and you meet the person, and sometimes it's on the phone, sometimes it's in a little room. Well, you sit down and you pick up the phone, and the hologram across from you picks up the phone and then starts to tell you their story. And again, it's profound to hear story after story. You could spend all day in that one room and talk to these 40 people who are telling you their story of incarceration. I think I got through about 10 before I just couldn't anymore. And then the last couple of rooms are exhibits of black artists. And it's just stunning. It's like it is a little art museum at the end of this museum. So I feel like I'm being fairly inarticulate because I'm still processing what I saw and heard. I'm guessing you can tell that this was a profoundly moving, shaking, soul-cracking open experience for me. I would encourage everyone to go to that museum. It is, and I would encourage you to Google it. If you Google Equal Justice Initiative or you Google Legacy Museum, you can see images of some of the statues and some of the rooms. I know I'm going a bit long here, but I want to talk about I can't even say it, the Lynching Memorial, although that's not what they call it. So the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, that's what it's called, and it's the first monument to commemorate the over 4,000 known African Americans who were lynched. So there are certainly others. 4,000 between 1877 and, depending how you count them, 1950. But there are many people who say that there were lynchings happening up until the early 1960s. It was a terrorist campaign with a very clear message that we are in control. You are not, and you're not going to get treated fairly at all by the law. Many people were grabbed out of prisons while awaiting trial. They were arrested on trumped-up charges. They were then dragged out of prison and lynched. So this memorial is for the 4,000 that we know of. When you go into the memorial, you enter through, it's mostly outdoors, and you enter through a little doorway. You have to go through security because one can only imagine what sort of threats they get, but you go through a metal detector and through security. And then you go up along a wall that has a quote from Dr. King on it. And there is a plaque, and the artist, the Ghanaian artist, his name is Kwame Akoto-Bamfo, who comes from the part of Ghana where many of those who were kidnapped and enslaved came from. He cast a concrete, multi-figure, standalone monument to the transatlantic slave trade. And it is 7 semi-nude Africans who are chained. And again, to stand next to this, and this is where I wish I could show you, but you have to Google this. And it's based on the Slavery Memorial, which is in Stone Town in Tanzania. So the expressions on the faces of these people with chained necks, manacled hands and feet, slashed backs. And I think for me, the most horrifying one, there was a chained young woman, obviously a mother, holding a screaming baby as she's reaching across to a man who's standing there. And you're looking at people. It makes, you cannot look away. You just cannot look away when you see this. And then there's a big open space called Memorial Square. And the grassy knoll represents spaces like town squares and courthouse lawns used for the public spectacle of lynching. So this is in the middle of a square that holds the monuments that I'm going to talk about in the middle. Inside the memorial, there are over 800 giant, long, rectangular steel boxes. Each is 6 feet in height. They're hanging by steel poles from the ceiling at even intervals. Each one of those 800 rectangles represents a county in which we know somebody was lynched. And on the name of each of those rectangles is listed the name and the date of the people who were lynched. So I decided, as I entered the part of the memorial that has all of these rectangles, that I was going to read every single name, that I felt it was what I had to do to witness to the lives, to recognize that these were people with names. And I was doing okay until I got about halfway through and hit a rectangle that had 40 names on it, 30 of which were on the same day. And it was clear that they were all related. And so, you're standing looking, I was standing looking at an entire family being obliterated. And the emotional weight of that, and again, I don't want to compare. I mean, there's no comparison between poor little white me, like looking at this and the terror that the people who experienced it went through. So I'm not telling you this so that y'all feel sorry for me, but more as an expression of how important I think it is that we all look at these names and look at these faces. This is part of telling the truth of who we are and what we have done, and and how that legacy reverberates. This is not constrained to history. None of this is constrained to history. There are so many Black people for whom, the reason they're in Chicago or Detroit or wherever is because they were fleeing this terror. And they did not come into the open arms of white Northerners saying, we're so glad you're here, now we're going to treat you, equally. They were put into ghettos in these cities. They're redlining so that they couldn't get mortgages. I mean, everything, just one after another, was designed to continue to separate us. And the sad part, well, there's so much that's sad about it. Sad's not even a good word. One of the horrors of this is that, as I tried to say in my sermon last week, this lie imprisons all of us. This lie that white people are inherently better imprisons white people almost as much as it imprisons Black people. Our whole society is based on this lie, and it keeps us separate, and it stops us from seeing each other as people, and it stops us from being able to tell the truth of where we've come from, and therefore it stops us from living into a different future. So anyhow, I'll stop preaching. I want to read, so I sat down and had myself a good cry on one of the benches. And one of the amazing staff, there were just amazing people in both the Lynching Memorial and the Legacy Museum. And I'm guessing they're used to people falling out, but one of them came over and sat next to me and just, sort of sat with me as I sobbed all over the place. And this person was just so kind. It was a young Black man, and I kind of looked at him and I said, I don't understand how you can be so nice to me. How do you work here every day and look at all of these names and not be filled with anger? And he said, I can't remember his exact words, but essentially he said, there are certainly times that I get angry, but I am privileged to be part of telling the truth so that we can do something different. I'm privileged to be part of the hope for change. And I was just like, okay. So along the third section of the memorial, so you're reading all of the names, these thousands of names, and then you come through towards the end of that, and there's a huge wall that has identifying the justifications for racial terror, lynching. So all of the accusations of inappropriate conduct with white women, that was a big one. If you spoke out against lynching, if you didn't show deference to white people. And after reading all of these texts and seeing all of these names, you then get to this quote. For the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned, and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember with hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice, with courage, because peace requires bravery, with persistence, because justice is a constant struggle, with faith, because we shall overcome. And then nearby, the final long wall of the memorial is a granite wall with metal lettering, with water flowing down it. And it asserts that all the victims of lynching now will be remembered. It says thousands of African Americans are unknown victims of racial terror lynchings whose deaths cannot be documented, many whose names will not be known. They are all honored here. And you stand and read that while listening to this sound of water. And I started thinking about baptism and all of this, and the parting of the Red Sea, and all of the ways in which water is sacred and life-giving, and how, while that water cannot erase everything that happened, that there is some healing in the flowing of the water and in those words. And there's a place that you can sit and contemplate. Then you come out. I'm going to end this with a whole bunch of quotes. So you come out after this, if you're at all human, emotionally brutal experience. And there are several long walls as you go up to another place that has all of the names engraved on ground level so that you can read them if you didn't want to look at them. And the first one is by Toni Morrison. And oh, my people out yonder, hear me. They do not love your neck unnoosed and straight. So love your neck. Put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it, and hold it up. And all your inside parts that they just as soon slop for hogs, you've got to love them. The dark, dark liver, love it, love it. And the beat and beating heart, love that too. More than eyes or feet, more than lungs that have yet to draw free air, more than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts. Hear me now, love your heart, for this is the prize. The final sculpture in this walk is by a man named Hank Willis Thomas, and it represents systemized police violence directed towards black men. It's called Raise Up. And it's a long horizontal, it's probably about as long as one of these pews, raised granite piece with hands and arms raised above bald heads. So these are all bronze portraits of black men with their arms raised. And these right near Akoto Bamfu's multi-figure statue of enslaved people underscore the main themes of the memorial part and of EJI's work. So it's slavery, lynching, segregation resistance, and mass incarceration. That's sort of their work. You end the last thing you see as you're leaving the museum, there's a garden right next to it, an absolutely beautiful garden that has an arch in it that's built with bricks that came out of, I'm going to get this wrong, came out of something that had been built by enslaved black people. So you're touching some work that they had done. And there's a poet, Elizabeth Alexander's poem, Invocation, is the last thing that you see. The wind brings your names. We will never dissever your names, nor your shadows beneath each branch and tree. The truth comes in on the wind, is carried by water. There is no such a thing as the truth. Tell us how you got over. Say, soul, look back in wonder. Your names were never lost, each name a holy word. The rocks cry out. Call out each name to sanctify this place. Sounds in human voices, silver or soil, a moan, a sorrow song, a keen, a cackle, harmony, a hymnal, handbook, chart, a sacred text, a stomp, an exhortation. Ancestors, you will find us still in cages, despised and disciplined. You will find us still misnamed. Here, you will find us despite. You will not find us extinct. You will find us here memoried and storied. You will find us here mighty. You will find us here divine. You will find us here where you left us, but not as you left us. Here you endure and are luminous. You are not lost to us. The wind carries sorrows, sighs, and shouts. The wind brings everything. Nothing is lost. So I've asked myself many times since I've come back what I learned. I don't think there's any one thing that I learned. I learned how much I don't know. I learned how easy it is to distance myself. I learned that I thought that I was one of the good white people. And what I learned was how much I still have to go, how much work I have to do on myself, how much work I have to do with you all, this body that is the church that represents Christ. I learned how this will be an ongoing, lifelong journey for me, for anyone who chooses to take up this work of looking the truth in the eyes, and of then, as Sarah said so beautifully in her sermon today, working for justice. I don't know what form that will look like for me personally, but I know that I cannot look away. And that if the church is called to do anything at this point in time, this work has to be it. This work has to be it. And I see it, so you all know I'm passionate about creation care. And so someone said to me, well, you kind of have to choose, right? And I'm like, no. Because if we really care, if we really view every single blessed thing as every single blessed thing, then we work for justice for every single blessed thing. And a big part of climate injustice, of creation injustice, has been directed at Black people. And that there is so much intersectionality between these two things. But if we, as the body of Christ, as the people who say in our baptismal vows that we will strive for justice and respect the dignity of every human being, if we cannot pick up this mantle and take up this work, then frankly we need to close up and go home, because we're kidding ourselves. And if we cannot, it is frightening, it is horrifying, it is identity shaking to look yourself in the mirror, I'm probably just talking about myself, and realize how much I don't know, and realize the things that I have done in the past that I just want to bow my head in shame. It's scary. It's scary to look at yourself as a white person in this country and to confront the truth of what we have done and what we continue to do. And it's terrifying. And we have to do it. We don't have a choice if we say we're following Christ. We have to do this. And so what I can tell you is, I don't know specifically what I am going to do except to try and be differently in the world, to continue to look in the mirror and look at my own complicity and look at the ways that I can stop being complicit with a system. And I will walk this journey with you. And that we, God's people, need to do this work together. We need to do it boldly, and we need to do it knowing that we're not doing it alone, that this is in fact God's work. And I'm not in any way trying to compare myself to Dr. King, but for him to have to wrestle with, is this the work that I'm called to do? You know, he who became another Moses, I don't even know where I'm going with that, but this is the work we are called to do. And so we will do this together because God is in, that's where I was going, because God is in this with us, because this is God's work. This is holy work. I will say that that when, after Sean left, and when I and members of the Small Search Committee were talking to Sarah, I don't know how many of you all know this, but part of Sarah's absolute life work has been working on justice, particularly justice around racial issues, around white supremacy, around dismantling it. This is her call. And so Sarah and I, but Sarah more than me, this is work that we want to lead y'all with and do with you. And it's not easy. It's just not easy. So for those of us who think, oh, sure, like, yeah, I can do this, it requires a deep reckoning with who we are. So I'm aware of in the Gospels when Jesus, there are many places where Jesus is telling his disciples some hard truths, like, you know, you don't stay to bury your father, don't do this, don't do the other. And people are kind of like, well, why is he being so mean? It's like, he's not being mean. He's simply telling you, if you want to walk this path, you're going to have to do some difficult things. It's like the high cost of discipleship. And basically, Jesus doesn't want anyone to enter into following him without realizing that it's going to be costly. And there are times you will feel profoundly uncomfortable, and there are times that you will wonder what you're doing and why you're doing it, and couldn't somebody else do this, and maybe this isn't so bad after all, and all of the things, all of the reasons that we can find to not do something. But so Jesus is just saying to his people, you need to know what you're getting into. And so I say that to all of us. I'm saying this to myself as much as to anybody else. You need to know what you're getting into. You need to know that if we do this work together, that there are times that you are going to feel profoundly uncomfortable, that there are times that you will feel like you just want to stop. And why are Claire and Sarah continuing to talk about this? Because you're making me feel uncomfortable, and you're making me feel afraid, and you're making me whatever. That's the sign that you're actually on the right path and that you're headed towards new life and growth. So I guess that's what I've come away with. What I've come away with is that I can no longer look away, that if we are to be faithful to Christ, that this is work that we cannot look away from. We have to do it together. So that's what I have to say. Anyone have any questions? I've just talked at you.
It's not a question, but it's an observation. I don't know if people have come by this time church. They have a display with the slave roster names, all the slaves owned by Mr. Hamilton along with the church next door. And I felt I had to read all the names. And there were so many. It was just a very small bit of what we saw. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, and Christ Church is actually about to do, and I'm going to be real vague on info here, because I am vague on info, but I'll get more to you. I know that they are doing something in March, I think, where they're reading the names of 492 Black Americans who were enslaved by people, parishioners at Christ Church. And this is part of their work of becoming beloved community. And I just got an email from the person who's organizing it. They have invited us to join them. So if anyone wants to either go or to actually read some of the names, let me know. Again, it's all part of truth telling. Other comments, or Sarah?
Our country is so young, so young. I guess I'll just say what I mean. When I went to the memorial, because I'm from Georgia, I went to all the counties where I have lived or where my family is from,
Yeah, and again, on the EJI's website, there are a bunch of videos, each of which is really good, many of which you can actually see when you're in the museum, but one of them follows, it's about 20 minutes, and it follows a family that I think I mentioned earlier, whose relative was lynched, and them talking about it, and then going to the actual place, finding the tree where I believe it was a man where he had been lynched, and sort of standing there and supporting each other. It's just, again, it's heartbreaking, but this is, I think this was like a grandfather or a great-grandfather. It wasn't, we're not talking like 500 years ago. We're talking about, 70 years ago. So.
It just seems timely because now there's real concern. It seems timely for us to focus on this because right now there's a concerted effort to change the history, to have a different narrative. We have a lot to learn about the truth, but there's also simultaneously a concerted effort to deny the truth. So I think it's very timely that we turn our attention to it.
Yeah, I agree. And, I guess the thing that gives me, because I can quickly get super despairing and, kind of like critical race theory, and now more states are not letting the truth be told. And, like you pick up a textbook in a significant part of the country, and what you read is that black people came to America for job opportunities. Not that they were kidnapped and enslaved, but they came here because they could get good work. Talk about whitewashing history. But I guess where I try and console myself, and I might be like seriously deluding myself, is that when you start to make headway against power, it lashes back quickly and strongly. And so I think it actually means that the tide is turning slowly. There is so much work still to be done, so I don't want to say, oh, if we just like hang out, it'll change. But I think this is when you start to threaten power, it comes back at you harder than ever. And there's nothing scarier than a white person frightened that we're going to lose our power. And when you get a whole bunch of us together, we're going to lash out big time. And that's exactly what's happening. So I just see it as we're actually there's enough noise being made now that it's a threat. What's that? Let's make more noise. So I'm going to close by saying I'm like plugging like crazy for EJI, but it's because they do just incredible work. Sarah has been carefully curating, so the Equal Justice Initiative, as part of their truth-telling, has a calendar that every day, you can buy a calendar, and I'd encourage you to do that so that you actually financially support their work, but you can, or you can just make a donation, but you can also go online. And so every day it tells a truth about the history of racism and white supremacy in this country. And Sarah, for Black History Month, has been curating a conversation. So Sarah, you want to tell people how to access that?
What's going on, either on the sidebar or on the bottom, there's a link to the EJI calendar, and the story of the day is a story of untold racial injustice that happened on that day. I remember the first year they got the calendar, and I was like, I guess they probably can't do one for every day, and it is so disheartening that they can, and they don't repeat stories most of the time in their years. But also in the part of what's going on, it's a link
So thank you all for listening. If